Fascism is thrown around by the left way too much, regardless if it makes sense to do so or not. To many, it is a buzzword, something that one doesn't like, or at best, vague authoritarianism. Be rest assured that I hope to avoid that mistake. I'll be using 4 different methods of determining if America can be considered fascist. 2 methods are from the right side of politics and 2 are from the left side of politics. Together, we will compare them to determine once and for all. Can we call America fascist? Let's find out. The first method I'll be using to determine if America might be fascist comes from the Holocaust Museum. This method is called the 14 Points of Fascism. Point 1. Powerful and continuing nationalism. What I believe is meant by powerful nationalism is the distinction between patriotism and nationalism, which Merriam-Webster does a good job of differentiating. It explains how nationalism and patriotism are considered synonyms that both have to do with loving one's country. But it states, and I quote, "Nationalism also includes exalting one's nation above all others, placing primary emphasis on promotion of its culture and interests, as opposed to those of other nations or supranational groups." I'll summarize this as referring to a feeling of national superiority that isn't just allowed, but encouraged by the nation in question, as well as international negligence. The first thing that came to mind between this and America is the era of Manifest Destiny. From 1820 through 1867, Christianity was used to justify Western expansion, racism, and genocide against native indigenous populations. Though with historical justification, the idea of manifest destiny existed in one form or another much earlier and continued much later. For instance, the 13 colonies wanted to expand into Western territories that were occupied by the British, which the British would not allow since they had just recovered from the French and Indian War. After the Revolutionary War between the colonies and the British, the colonies won the Western territories. Even before America was independent, its interests were above the interests of other nations, not just the British, but the native nations like the Iroquois Confederation, who considered people like George Washington and his father devourers of villages. In addition to those two, Founding Father Benjamin Franklin wrote remarks concerning the savages of North America. Truly, America saw itself as superior for referring to its neighbors as savages. During Manifest Destiny, there was the idea that the West was wild and needed to be tamed by occupying, settling, and acquiring lands against the natives' interests. And this mindset carried into even the 60s and 70s as Wild West movie genres became popular, of course, connected to superiority and ultranationalism. Even historians like Carlton Hayes and organizations such as the Foundation of Economic Education believe that ultranationalism has been a core principle of America. I believe it is fair then to say America has powerful and continuing nationalism. Point 2. Disdain for human rights. Simple enough. I'll be using the United Nations International Human Rights Law to provide a basis for human rights. One of the rights is the right to an adequate standard of living, and unfortunately for America, there are no laws, sections of the Constitution, binding resolution, or treaty that requires America to provide a minimum standard of living for all Americans. Such an issue has been brought up by the UNDHR numerous times. Another is the right to enjoy the benefits of cultural freedom. While most Americans do have the ability to express their cultures, Native American culture has been appropriated, commodified, and the indigenous people themselves are dwindling, all because of ongoing violations of the Indian Child Welfare Act and genocides. This coming from a documentary called The Ongoing Native American Genocide, as well as IndianCountryToday.com and their statistics. The UN also disagrees with torture, cruel or degrading punishment, and forced labor. Yet the US doesn't. In 2002, the Guantanamo Bay torture camp was established by the United States, where thousands of victims who were presumed guilty before innocent were tortured, degraded, and traumatized. This also violates the UN's right to presumed innocence. Even more recently, the US has been exposed by WikiLeaks for killing and torturing thousands of civilians and prisoners of war in Afghanistan and Iraq. And to this day in America, as revealed by currentaffairs.org, numerous prisoners have filed several lawsuits, stating that ongoing private prisons such as CoreCivic have violated the forced labor provision of the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. It is with all of this that without a doubt, America has a disdain for human rights. Point 3. Identification of enemies as a unifying cause. Most definitely inspired by Jews being the Nazis' scapegoat to justify their goals. This point has to refer to the scapegoats and false flags that justify national interests. It can be easily argued that Manifest Destiny was identifying Native Americans as savages that needed civility as enemies in order to unify American citizens towards the cause of Western expansion. The US also has a notable history of confirmed false flag operations. Vietnamese people were considered the enemy after the Gulf of Tonkin incident, an incident that was all faked under President Lyndon Johnson to unify the public in support of a war with Vietnam. More recently, the US has benefited from a loud and growing Islamophobia as it allowed people from Muslim-majority countries to enter America. This in turn has been used to justify unifying the public in favor of US interests in the Middle East. It is with that the US has and still identifies enemies towards unifying causes. Point 4. Supremacy of the military. Yet another vague point. I'll refer to any nation with a military that goes beyond existing to protect itself, and beyond capable of retaliating against aggressors, in order to be fair to most nations out there. No doubt the US favors a military that goes beyond protecting itself or retaliating against aggressors, from the fact that the US has been at war for 222 of its 239 years since 1776 alone. Around 25% of US tax dollars goes towards the military, resulting in billions per American. And the icing on the military-industrial cake has to be the national security strategy. This strategy declares that the US will not allow any other country to build up a military capability that could threaten US superiority, and that the US has the right to strike preemptively at any country it deems a threat. The US is definitely guilty of having a military supremacy complex. Point 5. Rampant sexism. Sexism is discrimination against any gender, and rampant means sexism that is allowed and continued. Like most countries in the world, America is affected by patriarchy. If not systematically, cultural patriarchy that discriminates, disables, and disadvantages women certainly exists. This is according to senior contributor and lawyer Tom Spiegel, who states that even in 2021, the gender pay gap still exists. Such a gap is systematic discrimination. It was brought up decades ago, and since then, there have still been the same conditions leading to the same issue. America has a rampant sexism problem. Point 6. Controlled mass media. Simple enough, this can be concluded quickly. According to former CIA Director William Colby, the Central Intelligence Agency owns everyone of any significance in major media. He gives detailed examples from buying out companies to buying and bribing journalists. If we are to trust a CIA director, America has controlled mass media. Point 7. Obsession with national security. I'll go by the idea that the nation in question is doing anything beyond basic measures to keep a country safe, especially if national security measures violate human rights or the nation's established rights, and if new security measures are unnecessary when the previous security measures were functional. We already covered how the US implemented its national security strategy to enforce military superiority across the world. But there's more. WikiLeaks has also exposed that the CIA has a hacking tool called Vault 7, which enables them to compromise cars, TVs, web browsers, phones, and computer systems, all in the name of national security. WikiLeaks also exposed that the US jointly owns the base at Pine Gap in Australia, which collects signals across the globe in order to spy on everyone. Even the National Security Agency has been exposed multiple times for collecting people's phone records and violating privacy. America has an obsession with national security. Point 8. Religion and government intertwined. I'll be referring to any major influence from religious organizations, all the way to theocratic social structures. The US has a history of favoring Christianity above all other religions, from the colonies coming to America to Manifest Destiny. But how about now? The Pledge of Allegiance still includes the lines "One Nation, under God" that most children must repeat every morning in school, and "In God We Trust" is still printed on every coin. Yet, what really determines how influential religious groups are, Pew Research Center's Forum on Religion and Public Life, as well as Lobbying for the Faithful, religious advocacy groups in Washington, D.C., have both revealed startling information. Religious lobbying groups have grown over 5 times, from less than 40 in the 70s to more than 200 today. All religious lobbying groups together spend $390 million a year trying to push their agendas and views onto everyone else through the government system. 212 religious organizations have so far been discovered in Washington, D.C. alone that employ nearly 1,000 people, many of these groups registered as lobbying groups. We need to give credit where it's due. America has, in fact, secularized more over the years, but the US is still influenced significantly by religious groups. One could even say intertwined. Point 9. Corporate power protected. In our world that is dominated by capitalist nations, most of these nations would fall under this point for protecting corporate rights, such as private property. To be fair, I will go off of point 8 as a format for point 9. Corporate power and government are intertwined, that is, significant influence from corporations to the point where the nation in question cannot function without it, as well as violations of human rights to protect corporate power. Corporations spend nearly $2.6 billion a year on lobbying expenditures in the United States, and lobbying has only been increasing since the 2000s. From the same source, the biggest companies have upwards of 100 lobbyists representing them, and of the 100 organizations that spend the most on lobbying, 95 consistently push their business interests in our so-called democracy. Corporate power isn't just protected in the US, it is expected by hundreds of lobbyists that spend billions to keep the House of Representatives, Senate, and lobby-reliant presidents in their pockets. Thus, the US fits under point 9. Point 10. Labor power suppressed. This can include a significant decrease in working class power, as well as the lack of workers' rights in general, such as public assembly, strikes, unionizing, etc., occurring within the nation in question. Many are aware in school that child labor used to be legal. People worked long hours for little wages, and the idea of a minimum wage didn't even come into place until 1938. To this day, onlabor.org claims that there are 21.2 million youth laborers in the US. According to them, and I quote, "The United States has more of its youth in the workforce than any other developed country in the world," end quote. Of these youth, they only need to be paid a minimum of $4.25 an hour for the first 90 days. It's also been estimated that 153,600 children work in violation of child labor laws per week. The US is the only country in the Americas without a national paid parental leave benefit. 134 countries have laws that set a maximum length of work except for the US. According to the OECD, US workers work an extra 100 hours over the national average for all countries, and the US is one of 3 countries in the world that fails to allow workers 20 paid vacation days. Not only is this suppressing workers in general, but violating the UN's declared human right to have just and favorable working conditions. On top of all of this, a major decline in labor union participation has been happening in the past 40 years. From a quarter of workers being in unions to only 6.7% in the private sector. This has led to increased income inequality, an increase in racial inequality, and a lack of workers' political power. Labor power is definitely suppressed in America, not to mention the lack of workplace democracy. Point 11. Disdain for intellectuals and the arts. Going to assume that this point refers to the Nazis' own anti-intellectualism, in favor of pseudo-historical mythology and esotericism. StudioAtao.org says, "History demonstrates that anti-intellectualism is no mistake, accident, or a result of individual or historical bias. While its forms may change depending on circumstances of the time, anti-intellectualism is, as historian Richard Hofstadter points out, fundamentally American." It can be traced back as early as European settlers bringing with them their evangelical Protestantism, and in the 1960s, a rivalry broke out between the New Left and neoconservatism, with the New Left favoring social change and neoconservatives favoring anti-intellectualism. A 2020 analysis found that adults who primarily use social media for their news were more likely to believe in unproven or false claims, while being less knowledgeable on the topics presented. According to principal scientist Dane Clausen, commoditized information naturally tends to reflect the assumptions and interests of those who produce it, and its producers are not driven to promote critical reflection. I have barely scratched the surface of modern anti-intellectualism in the US, but with these multiple sources, I feel confident to say that America has a disdain for intellectuals, if not the arts. Point 12. Obsession with crime and punishment. A vague point that I'll assume is when the nation in question has an ignored or ever-growing issue in criminality, and the allowance of inhumane punishments to occur by its own institutions. America's human rights violating private prisons and torture camps have already been mentioned. It is overkill, then, to mention that before COVID-19, 9 state prison systems were operating at a capacity greater than 100%. Even in the pandemic, 41 states were operating at 75% or more of their capacity, with at least 9 of those state prison systems still operating at more than 100%. PrisonPolicy.org says, prison overcrowding has always been a serious problem, correlated with increased violence, lack of adequate healthcare, limited programming, and educational opportunities. I should mention that failing to provide adequate healthcare and education opportunities is more human rights violations according to the UN. The US is also ranked 6th in the world for the most confirmed executions in 2019. All of this makes America obsessed with crime and punishment, especially for failing to address many of its preventable prison problems. Point 13. Rampant cronyism and corruption. With lobbying already being brought up earlier, it still gets worse. How about the Contra affair, when the US unconstitutionally traded American hostages for weapons? Or Operation Husky and Operation Underworld, FBI collaborations with Italian mafias? America definitely has rampant cronyism and corruption. Point 14. Fraudulent elections. This point is a repeat of rampant cronyism and corruption to me, so I'll therefore consider it a part of point 13. This has been 14 early signs of fascism in accordance with the Holocaust Museum. The fact that America meets every point with countless past and present examples should make one really question the validity of their government. But we still have 3 methods before we determine if we can call America fascist or not. The next method comes from political theorist and historian Roger Griffin, and his idea of generic fascism called palingenetic ultranationalism. He calls fascism to be defined by its core myth. Core myths are somewhat vague in themselves. America has a few of its own national mythologies that fuel its nationalism, such as the idea that the United States is a free and democratic country, but freedom is very vague, since there are of course laws and limits to its own rights, as well as a lack of democracy, instead favoring republic-style indirect elections, with the Electoral College, faithless electors, gerrymandering, and so on. But Roger Griffin gives the idea of national rebirth, or palingenesis, and ultranationalism as the core myth for fascism to be present. He argues that this palingenetic myth is used to attract large masses of voters, who lost their faith in traditional politics by promising them a greater future under their rule. He even notes that other political ideologies can incorporate some palingenetic aspects in their party programs. This makes it less obvious to determine if America is fascist or not, since nearly every politician makes populist declarations to improve the country better than it was before. Even Trump, who threw mottos like "Make America Great Again," never changed the system of government or economy from what it was. So he can't really be called fascist as much as fascists supported him. What makes the question even harder to answer is the fact that even in Trump's era, he definitely was a mythical hero to many people, who hoped for him to restore order back into the system they saw as decadent. Fortunately, there is a word that doesn't answer can we call America fascist with a no or a yes. Proto-fascism. that is, ideologies and movements which form a basis for fascism to develop and grow. Considering Trump's failed re-election attempt started a revolution, if you can call it that, with a majority of its participants being identified fascist by the FBI and public, America is proto-fascist. Maybe the next two methods will help us give an answer, passing the more conservative methods of fascist determination and entering more left-wing methods. This next method comes from political scientist and historian Michael Parenti's essay, Black Shirts and Reds, the first chapter of Rational Fascism in particular. I'd like to point out this passage, which talks about the actions of dictator Benito Mussolini. To maintain profit levels, the large landowners and industrialists would have to slash wages and raise prices. The state in turn would have to provide them with massive subsidies and tax exemptions. To finance this corporate welfarism, the populace would have to be taxed more heavily, and social services and welfare expenditures would have to be drastically cut. Measures that might sound familiar to us today. What stood out the most to me was Parenti, an American, saying measures that might sound familiar to us today, an outright comparison of fascist Italy with modern America. He then goes on to explain that Mussolini's obstacle was that workers already had working class rights, such as unionizing and accommodating wages, in which it states, the solution was to smash their unions, political organizations, and civil liberties. Industrialists and big landowners wanted someone at the helm who could break the power of organized work and farm laborers and impose a stern order on the masses. Michael Parenti even mentions that in the 1920s, the Nazis were subsidized by businesses to act as anti-labor forces that terrorized workers. I immediately thought of the Coal Wars in America from 1890 to 1930. To summarize that period of conflicts, coal operators paid detectives and law enforcement to keep union organizers out of the regions by intimidation, harassment, espionage, and murder. Coal miners tried to overthrow the system by going on strike, which was met with harsh violence, even leading to machine guns firing upon women, men, and children. The intimidation and violence done against workers in America are quite comparable to the way workers were treated under Benito Mussolini. It's explained that Mussolini seized the media such as newspapers and political parties after gaining power. As already mentioned, the CIA has a lot of influence on media as we know it today. Even Mussolini having countless party members imprisoned or killed is reminiscent of the United States Operation Condor and its total of 56 coups, assassination attempts, and party overthrowing overseas in South America. Not to mention that quite a few people America replaced in South America were dictators, like Augusto Pinochet, who went on to kill thousands of political opponents and send thousands more into concentration camps under US backing. Then Parenti says, at the same time, taxes were increased for the general populace, but lowered or eliminated for the rich and big business. Inheritance tax on the wealthy were greatly reduced or abolished altogether. According to ProPublica.org, the 25 richest Americans paid little to no federal income taxes. It is astonishing how fascist movements in Italy and Germany both used the profit incentive to gain power while supported by businesses. To Parenti, fascism is misrepresented as a mutant form of socialism. In fact, if fascism means anything, it means all-out government support for business and severe repression of anti-business, pro-labor forces. As well as this part, along with serving the capitalists, fascist leaders serve themselves, getting in on the money at every opportunity. Their personal greed and their class loyalties were two sides of the same coin. We've already seen how corporations have sunken their teeth heavily into America's government, how labor forces are being belittled and submerged, among the many other warning signs. And we know that capitalism, which America is, lives off the idea of the profit incentive. This leads to another passage by Parenti. The greatest source of Hitler's wealth was a secret slush fund to which leading German industrialists regularly donated. Hitler knew that as long as German industry was making money, his private money sources would be inexhaustible. Thus, he'd see to it that German industry was never better off than under his rule, by launching, for one thing, gigantic armament projects, or what we call today fat defense contracts. If you think I'm pulling bits out of my butt, by suggesting that corporations in America could be swayed by the profit incentive to collaborate with and empower fascists. According to Parenti, American corporations have already done it before. Italian fascism and German Nazism had their admirers within the US business community and the corporate-owned press. Bankers, publishers, and industrialists, including the likes of Henry Ford, traveled to Rome and Berlin to pay homage, receive medals, and strike profitable deals. Many did their utmost to advance the Nazi war effort, sharing military-industrial secrets and engaging in secret transactions with the Nazi government, even after the United States entered the war. As well as, the Italian-language press in the United States eagerly joined the chorus. The two most influential newspapers, L'Italia of San Francisco, financed largely by A.R. Giannini Bank of America, and Tu Progresso of New York, owned by multimillionaire Generoso Pope, looked favorably on the fascist regime and suggested that the United States could benefit from a similar social order. And finally, Michael Parenti explains fascism to us. Much of politics is the rational manipulation of irrational symbols. Certainly, this is true of fascist ideology, whose emotive appeals have served a class control function. First, there was the cult of the leader. With leader worship, there came the idolatry of the state. It extols the harsher human impulses of conquest and domination, while rejecting egalitarianism, democracy, collectivism, and pacifism as doctrines of weakness and decadence. According to Parenti, for fascism to work, people must see themselves as part of a harmonious whole, rich and poor as one, a view that supports the economic status quo by cloaking the ongoing system of class exploitation. This is in contrast to a left agenda that advocates the articulation of popular demands and a sharpened awareness of social injustice and class struggle. Which leads me off to my own thoughts. If nationalism in itself requires one to love a nation and to see the nation as their own, as inseparable from themselves, and if fascism arises from the happenstance of people uniting under nationalism, how can we really trust that the representatives in America won't push nationalism in such a way as to push others towards fascistic goals, especially when the goals of fascists and the goals of corporations are both mutually beneficial and not too dissimilar? So, with Michael Parenti's essay on black shirts and reds, I have to stick with the previous conclusion, that the United States is quite proto-fascist. It's scarily similar enough to the fascist doctrines and actions in Italy and Nazi Germany, and the fact that American media, politicians, and corporations showed intrigue in such fascists really deludes the distinctions between American and fascist interests. But before reaching any final conclusions, I must go over one last method of determining fascism. This next method comes from quite the extremes of leftism, Marxism. According to the Communist Third International, fascism in power is the open, terroristic dictatorship of the most reactionary, the most chauvinistic, the most imperialist elements of finance capitalism. From this, it is stated that fascism represents the last attempt of the capitalist class to preserve its grip on power against the odds of a working-class revolution. Fascist movements are not necessarily created by the ruling class, but often gain political power with the help and funding from big business. And once in power, fascists serve the interests of their benefactors. According to Trotsky, the historic function of fascism is to smash the working class, destroy its organizations, and stifle political liberties when the capitalists find themselves unable to govern and dominate with the help of democratic machinery. It's even stated that, to left communist Amedeo Bediga, fascism was just another form of capitalist rule on the same level as liberal democracy or traditional monarchies. He didn't seem to believe that fascism was particularly exceptional. According to the Encyclopedia of Marxism, fascism places a very strong emphasis on patriotism and nationalism. Criticism of the nation's main ideals, especially war, is lambasted as unpatriotic at best and treason at worst. State propaganda consistently broadcasts threats of attack while justifying preemptive war. I think it says a lot that this video can even be made. How throughout most of the video, it's never really obvious that America is or isn't fascist. Regardless if it is or isn't, that's really the big takeaway in my opinion. Countries like America and many more tread dangerously along middle lines and gray areas. The first method of determining fascism by the Holocaust Museum would suggest that America is fascist, but most of the points are up for interpretation and are a bit vague in themselves. In the second method, Roger Griffin had the right idea of trying to notice what stands out between fascists and all else, but, as Michael Parenti mentioned in the third method, the relationship between capitalism, big business, and fascism is quite interconnected. This only seems to be backed by many Marxian theorists who see fascism as almost like capitalism's backup plan. Now, I'm not one to tell anyone what to think or what to do, but some of the questions I think we Americans should ask are this. Can we truly trust the ruling powers that are so deeply lodged with corporations, lobbying, and capitalists? Can we truly trust the powers that have over and over again shown disdain for human rights and the power of the common worker? How can we guarantee that America won't put its interest towards fascism, especially if we start protesting and criticizing our government? All in all, I don't think America is fascist, but I think America has high potential and ability to be so. Fascism has a historical basis in sharing similar interests with capitalism and sustaining capitalism when it is failing the most. Yet, I think most of us can agree that fascism is bad. If we're going to be against fascism, we're going to be against capitalism. I guess that's why the right to bear arms exists, right? Even though such rights existed in Germany before the Nazis took over. So, I guess when the time comes, which side are you on?
Which side are you on, boy? Which side are you on, my lord? Which side are you on,